The first thing he noticed was the way the wine trembled in the glass, a subtle ripple he felt rather than saw, as if the room itself had exhaled in warning just before everything changed. The restaurant in downtown Chicago glowed with warm light and polished wood, the kind of place where men like him came to feel untouchable, yet something in the air had shifted, thin and sharp, and it pressed against his chest with a quiet urgency that made his pulse stumble. What if this were you, seated in a room where power had always obeyed your slightest nod, and suddenly your instincts told you that power had slipped from your hands without permission? Would you trust that instinct, or dismiss it as fatigue? Anthony Russo had spent 2 decades climbing from a South Side street runner to the kind of man whose name silenced rooms. He had buried friends, betrayed mentors, and told himself that every loss was the price of survival. Tonight was supposed to be simple, a quiet dinner to celebrate a new shipment and an old alliance, but simplicity had never truly belonged in his world. He felt it then, the way a hunted animal feels the shadow before the trap snaps shut, and his eyes lifted just as the waitress leaned closer than necessary, her posture stiff, her breath uneven, her fear brushing against him like a cold hand. She did not look at him the way servers usually did. She looked at him the way people look at storms on the horizon. Her name was Grace Miller, though he did not know it yet, and she had not planned on being brave that night. She was 27, a church-going daughter of a factory worker from Indiana, carrying the weight of student debt and a sick mother on her shoulders. She had taken the late shift because it paid better, unaware that fate sometimes waits behind linen tablecloths and crystal glasses. When she had overheard the murmured tension in the kitchen, the sudden change in security patterns, the way unfamiliar men slipped through a side entrance meant only for staff, something inside her had tightened. She had seen fear before, in hospital corridors and eviction notices, and she recognized it now in the way the restaurant staff avoided one particular table. If this were you, would you stay silent and safe, or risk everything for a stranger whose life was about to unravel? Anthony sensed her presence before he fully understood her intention, a whisper brushing past his ear without words, a warning shaped by urgency rather than sound. His body reacted before his mind caught up, muscles stiffening, breath slowing, the old training rising like a ghost. He did not move, not because he was calm, but because stillness had saved him before. Around him, laughter continued, forks clinked, candles flickered, and no one else seemed to notice that the room had become a loaded gun. Betrayal, when it comes, rarely announces itself. It arrives wearing familiar faces and trusted hands. Anthony's mind raced backward through recent weeks, through meetings that felt slightly off, through smiles that lingered too long. He thought of Michael O'Hara, a man he had pulled from the gutter years ago and elevated into comfort, a man who had sworn loyalty with trembling sincerity. He thought of the shipment that had gone missing, the phone call that had come too late. Regret crept in quietly, the kind that asks what you might have done differently if you had allowed yourself to feel instead of command. Grace stepped away as if nothing had happened, her hands shaking as she poured water for another table. Her heart pounded so hard she feared it might betray her, but she forced herself to breathe, remembering her father's voice telling her that faith without action was just fear in disguise. She had no weapon, no plan, only the fragile belief that doing nothing would haunt her more than whatever consequences followed. In that moment, her life split into before and after, and she felt the sharp clarity of choice that people speak about in testimonies, the kind that reshapes who you are. The men came fast, faster than Anthony had expected, emerging from places that should have been safe. The betrayal crystallized then, heavy and undeniable, and he understood that survival would require something he had rarely offered the world: trust. He let the chaos pass him like a wave, using the confusion of shattering glass and startled screams to slip from his seat and follow the narrow path Grace had unknowingly opened. His heart hammered not with fear, but with a strange, aching gratitude that unsettled him more than the danger. They found themselves in the service corridor, the hum of refrigerators masking their breaths, the smell of cleaning chemicals sharp in the air. Grace moved without looking back, driven by instinct and prayer, and Anthony followed, aware that every step away from the dining room was a step away from the man he had been. He felt the weight of his past pressing down on him, the faces of those he had hurt lining the walls of his memory, and for the first time in years, he wondered if escape could mean more than staying alive. Outside, the night air hit them like baptism, cold and unforgiving. Sirens wailed in the distance, not yet close enough to matter, and Anthony knew he could disappear, call in favors, rebuild somewhere else as he always had. Yet he found himself watching Grace crouch behind a dumpster, tears streaking her face as she whispered prayers under her breath, and something inside him cracked open. This woman owed him nothing, yet she had risked everything. What kind of man walks away from that? The aftermath came quietly, as aftermaths often do. News reports spoke of an attempted hit, of internal conflict within a criminal organization, of a man presumed dead. Anthony let that version of himself die willingly. He sent money anonymously to Grace's mother's hospital, watched from a distance as Grace found new work and slowly reclaimed her peace. He carried the memory of her courage like a compass, guiding him through nights when old instincts clawed at his resolve. Months later, in a small church on the outskirts of the city, Anthony sat in the back pew, listening to a sermon about forgiveness that felt uncomfortably personal. He was not redeemed, not yet, but he was trying, and trying was a beginning he had once mocked. He thought about how close he had come to ending as he began, surrounded by power and alone, and how a single act of compassion had shifted the trajectory of 2 lives. Grace never knew the full weight of what she had changed, and perhaps that was the point. Some acts of kindness are not meant to be measured, only felt, their ripples extending beyond our sight. Anthony understood now that second chances are rarely grand gestures, they are quiet moments where someone chooses to care when it would be easier not to. Before this story ends, take a moment to reflect and share in the comments what you would have done if you were in that restaurant, faced with fear and the chance to act. And if this story stirred something inside you, if it reminded you of the power of courage, kindness, and second chances, please consider liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing, but only if it truly touched your heart.